Thank you so much. Oh, okay, being recorded. Yes, thank you so much, Monica, for the intro, and thank you to the workshop organizers for having me. I'm really excited to share with you a little bit about my recent book, The Education Trap: Schools and the Remaking of Inequality in Boston. And I was telling the organizers that today is the official publication day of the book, so it's a fun time to be here and present. And I'm really looking forward to, an interdisciplinary conversation, hearing from you how some of my historical arguments, how we can engage in them from multiple disciplinary perspectives. So thanks again for having me. Let me go ahead and share this with you. Can you all see my screen now? Okay, great. So here's the book. If you want to learn a little bit more about it, I've put the link in the chat. But to get started, my research is really driven by a central paradox, and that's the relationship between education and social inequality in the United States. There are different ways of thinking about this relationship. So in the words of Thomas Piketty, the best way to increase wages and reduce wage inequalities in the long run is to invest in education and skills. And so his policy recommendation recalls a long line of arguments about education as a way of addressing social inequality. This tradition goes back to Horace Mann, at least, leader of the common school movement in the mid-19th century, who called education the great equalizer. My own interests in education and inequality stem from reading a lot of John Dewey as an undergrad, and his vision of education that would, quote, of itself tend to do away with the evils of the existing economic situation. So in other words, we have a lot of different theorists and ideas of how education can be used to create a more egalitarian society. Historically, the US has had very high levels of education. And this is in northern states in the US, not in the South. And I'm going to talk a little about racial inequality later on, but on average, so this chart shows mean years of schooling for different countries. And you can see in green in the US, since 1870 up to 2017, the US has had, people have been in school for the most amount of time, or in the US compared to a few other countries. But there's kind of a paradox, or the central paradox, and that is while the US has very high levels of educational access and attainment, comparatively speaking, it also has one of the highest rates of social inequality. So this chart shows the share of income by the top 1% since the 1970s. And as you can see, the US in blue, right, is the highest of all these countries. By 2015, nearly 20% of total income was earned by the top 1% in the United States. And this is a chart that I think does of sort of summing up this paradox. So it compares measures of educational inequality on the y-axis and then socioeconomic inequality on the x-axis. So if we look at the US, we can see that it actually is, it's sort of middle or low on the y-axis on educational inequality, meaning that if you are from a poor background in the US, you're actually more likely to complete college compared to a poor student in some of these other countries higher up, Japan, Germany, Switzerland. At the same time, so even though the US has a fairly good measure of educational equity, it is also furthest on the right in terms of socioeconomic inequality. So in sum, although many people are getting educated at very high rates, the US economy is extremely unequal. If Horace Mann were right, it seems like this couldn't be true, right? This is sort of the paradox. So in my research, I show how this seeming paradox can be explained by looking not at the 1970s, which is where a lot of historical social inequality in our modern era look at, but actually by going back much earlier to the early 20th century. And the early 20th century was a period of enormous educational growth, also a period of rapid economic growth and the rise of our kind of modern corporate economy. And like today, social inequality reached an all-time height in the 1920s, right before the Great Depression. So it's a period that in a lot of ways has similarities to our own, right, where there's high educational enrollment, but also very high social inequality. And my argument in brief is that if we look at the expansion of our educational system and the economy in this early 20th century period, we can see how school-based education becomes a new basis or a new way of structuring social inequality in this country, even as it created some opportunities for social mobility for many people. And this was because in its expansion, schools had kind of multiple functions. They gave some people social mobility, but they were also used as tools to undercut the power of workers in some sectors, especially craft workers, as I'm going to talk about in a moment. And at the top, kind of elite schools, especially colleges and universities, become a new way for a professional elite to concentrate their power. So these kind of multiple uses of a new educational system help explain how we can have very high rates of education while also having very high rates of inequality. So these historical developments were rooted in a really important shift in work, in the nature of work in the US. And that's, the book sort of traces this shift over different economic sectors. And that's a shift from workplace training for most jobs in the late 19th century to school-based training for work in the 20th century. So in the, say, the 1880s, right, very few Americans went to school beyond primary school, beyond 8th grade. Most people accessed work through sort of informal social ties or family connections, and they learned their job like on the job, right? They didn't go to formal school to learn how to do it. There were some, there are already some schools in this period, high schools, academies, and colleges, but these catered primarily to a small elite. And even for some of the professions that we associate with like a long period of education, so law, medicine, it was still more common to do a kind of informal apprenticeship or mentorship in these professions rather than attend like a law school or a medical school, a professional school. So that's the late 19th century. Over the next few decades, school enrollments rise across all classes and ethnic groups, and school-based jobs becomes the norm across the economy. And this shift helped to turn educational credentials into a new basis of inequality, is my argument. So I've given you kind of the brief overview. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about how I'll structure the rest of the talk. I'll talk about a few different theoretical frameworks for how other scholars have approached the relationship between education and inequality, many of which you all are probably familiar with, mostly drawing from the social sciences. Then I'll talk about the scope of my project, research methods, a little bit more detail about the argument, and then I'll conclude with what I see as the major payoffs and implications of this research. So the relationship between education and inequality has been theorized mostly in disciplines outside, actually, so economics, sociology, and political science. The dominant tradition in economics equates education with the provision of human capital, right, or skills that are compensated with higher wages in the labor market. And economists like Claudia Golden have argued that since the 1970s, educational attainment has slowed down as skill-biased technological change, or technological change that those with high skills, has advanced. And this has meant, this is sort of her explanation for why we have high inequality now, is because only the very highly skilled have access to these highly technical jobs, leaving those with lower skills behind and leading to rising inequality. So the policy implication of this human capital framework is we need more education, right, to solve the problem of social inequality. A more critical sociological tradition frames education as a mechanism of social stratification. So education as cultural capital or credentials doesn't function primarily as an indicator of skills, but rather as a way to sort individuals or to restrict access to elite occupations. So in this tradition, the policy implication is that education can actually make inequality worse, or that education becomes this new way of stratifying society. And then another approach in political science argues that education or skill formation regimes evolved within specific varieties of capitalism. And in these typologies, the US is often characterized as a liberal market economy. And some of the features include, a pretty unregulated labor market, very little employment protections, and high social inequality. And countries are coordinated market economies, and these have more well-regulated vocational training regimes, more employee protections, and less social inequality. And this literature focuses a lot on vocational training, and European vocational training is often held up as a model for how education might be structured differently to help reduce inequality. And all of these frameworks, I think, are premised on really different underlying mechanisms, and they point to different policy solutions.
Can you talk through a little bit about how you define social inequality? Is a question from Steve in the chat.
Yes, in the book and in general, I'm talking about socioeconomic inequality. So income inequality, some of the charts that I showed you show income inequality. So I'm really looking at measures of economic inequality. But in the way that I am thinking about it historically, I'm also thinking about it as ways of determining like who has power in the economy. So those with very little, low wage workers or non-organized workers have very little power economically, and elites tend to have a lot of both political and economic power. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about inequality. Does that help?
Yeah, it helps. I guess if we think about, you could imagine a meritocracy in which there's vast inequality, but it wouldn't be structured by the circumstances of your birth. Some people would think that was great. Other people would think
right.
So then there's also, so there's, I guess sociologists would distinguish between economic inequality and social mobility.
Yeah.
I think you're talking in different terms. That's fine, but maybe clarifying that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think it's also that I'm lumping together, in thinking about the historical ways that education has been seen as a kind of social panacea. I think there's a range of ways that it's been understood. Some people focus primarily on education as a way of creating more opportunity for social mobility, but right, that doesn't necessarily equal a more egalitarian, social equality. And then there are others, and I think probably the biggest, the framework that I'm pushing back on maybe the most directly is this specific line of argumentation in economics, where actually the theory is that more education is going to reduce inequality measured in terms of income or economic inequality. But you're right that, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways of thinking about this that are not always, I think historically we see a lot of different arguments sort of operating at the same time.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll keep going, but yeah, please feel free to interrupt. So all of these, I've talked about sort of these different frameworks, and now I want to talk a little bit about what my historical approach brings. So I kind of set about to understand this paradox historically, and I think within the discipline, education is not, it still sort of exists as like a separate subfield. It's not always well integrated into studies of politics or the economy. And also a lot of educational literature is really divided by type of institution. So K through 12, right, higher education, or folks that look at public versus private education. There's a lot of divisions in the literature. Whereas I wanted to sort of look at all of these things together and see how they interacted historically. And I think there's a number of features of historical analysis that are really valuable. One is that rather than looking for sort of universal mechanisms that operate across time and space, history reveals the contingency and the specificity of historical developments, and in particular places in the United States, and shows that they weren't inevitable, right? That they emerged as a result of particular historical circumstances. History also shows that this evolution was contested, and I will stress and talk about conflict over, you know, even though we end up with one result, there's a lot of different ideas and conflict between different groups of people that shape the outcome. And then finally, history reveals how the role and meaning of formal education has changed dramatically over time. So the social function of education that we might take for granted today, you know, as I was saying, like in the late 19th century, you didn't need formal education to access work. So history can sort of help us think outside or step outside of our contemporary frameworks a little bit better. And I draw on, you know, human capital, credentialist theory, skill formation regimes. I draw on a lot of these social science frameworks to explain parts of the story of what's going on. But I think history as a broader interpretive lens can help us put some of these frameworks together or see where they fit and maybe where they don't totally explain the whole. All right, so the scope of the project, because I wanted to trace the changing role of education within the political economy, I chose to look across different types of education and different economic sectors. So different types of education means things like workplace apprenticeship, informal mentorship, inside the home and family connections, in broader cultural and social institutions like settlement houses or churches, and then of course, formal education in schools. And among schools, I looked at sort of a whole range of different institutional types. So public schools, parochial schools, for-profit schools that did exist. There were 19th century for-profits, colleges, professional schools, and these institutions in the 19th century did not really make up a clearly graded hierarchy. They basically post-secondary education, sort of a mix of different institutional types, and that the kind of the grades had not been solidified yet. And I also look at training across all major sectors of the economy, and each chapter sort of focuses on a different piece. So low-wage workers, craft workers, white-collar workers, and professionals. To make this full cross-section feasible, I focused my investigation on the city of Boston. And Boston is unique in certain ways. The Northeast had very high rates of public school enrollment. It had a lot of private institutions, especially colleges. But this really sort of rich ecology of schools and the role of Boston in pioneering a lot of national developments in education, I think makes it an ideal place in a lot of ways to look at the relationship between schools and economy. And Boston in this period was a major financial and industrial center. It had a lower African American population than a lot of other northern cities at the time, but it had a similar rate of immigrants and sort of an immigrant population. So I think we can use Boston as kind of a case study to look at a lot of trends occurring across urban America. All right, so I use both quantitative and qualitative methods. I used IPM census samples. So these are individual level data taken directly from the manuscript censuses. And while I was working on the book, IPM's put out new 100% samples for every census from 1880 to 1940, which was kind of perfect because that was the time period that I was looking at. And I think, as far as I know, I think this, or my book is one of the first to use, the first sort of book length projects to use these 100% samples, or basically complete data sets, which offer just sort of a huge wealth of data. And just, you're able to, within 100% sample, you can be as specific as you want with, what segments of the population you want to look at, or which occupations you want to look at. So I use census data to look at the racial and ethnic composition of different occupations, school enrollment by all kinds of, by race, by gender, by age, and class background. And I'll provide a few more examples of sort of how I use this data in a moment. But this was a really important, there's sort of a quantitative backbone of the project. Just an image of sort of what the manuscript census looks like if you are actually reading it, reading the original, but this is now all digitized. And I also supplemented census data with a lot of traditional historical sources. So annual reports, school catalogs, newspapers, trade journals, letters, diaries, yearbooks. And I got these from archives all across the Boston area. And these archives are just useful to find information about schools and students, but they also included things like company records about hiring practices. And I talk a lot about, how people found work. So looking at the process of hiring is really important in analyzing this development. So this sort of historical approach, I really tried to mix quantitative and qualitative, and use the qualitative sources like these to help contextualize some of the trends that I was finding in the quantitative data. All right, so I'll describe my argument in a little bit more detail. I think the best way to think about the overarching argument of the book is that it really lays out two parallel developments that together restructure the educational system and the labor market, and ultimately help explain the paradox that I started with. So one side of the transformation is the failure of a lot of efforts to provide school-based training for low wage and for industrial work. So in this half, despite a lot of efforts of reformers to expand vocational training for these jobs, which they would make these jobs better, would increase wages, school-based training for these types of work are very limited, either due to lack of appeal of training for these types of jobs, or conflict between unions, especially in the industrial sector, and employers that limit the success of school-based training. On the other hand, in the arena of white collar work, so this is things like clerk, management positions, the professions, schools are incredibly successful in providing pathways into these new occupations. In white collar work, there's very few interests. There's basically no craft unions in this sector. So there's no interests that really oppose schooling. And so you get a bunch of different kinds of schools that really compete with each other to provide training in this sector. And this process of competition really drives forward, I think, more schools and more credentials in these fields. And I argue that these two parallel transformations, what's the sort of failure in low wage and industrial work, the success in white collar work, are really two sides of the same coin. They're both transformations in the economy in this period and a shift of power in the economy that's going on in the 20th century. So first I'll talk a little bit more about low wage and industrial work, and then I will turn to white collar work.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I think this is like maybe a slightly different question than like what you're getting at here, but so if part of like the argument is like why education can't solve social inequality, like are you also looking like within each of the sectors, not just like if education works as a whole, or if school-based, work training works as a whole within the education, but also like who has access and how like the inequality in access or inequality like within those programs can contribute?
Yes, yeah, no, exactly. I think like I want to make a more nuanced argument, because I do think that, and I'll talk about how like in white collar work, actually for women that look like this in this picture, schools really did provide, access to social mobility, and part of consolidating this idea of education as a way of accessing the American dream. And because it was rooted in this very particular historical circumstance and for a particular population. However, like at the same time that you have this going on in this sector, I'm also going to talk about, these other trends, what's going on in industrial work, what's going on with the professions. And we can see how in some of those sectors, education does not actually succeed in leading to, in giving workers more power on the job or reducing inequality, but actually become real, like in professional work, become tools of kind of concentrating power and wealth. So I definitely want to make a more, I have sort of a broader framing of, education can't solve social inequality broadly, but when we look historically, I want to make a more nuanced argument about where it works and where it doesn't. Yeah, any other questions before I keep going? Okay. All right, so yeah, so I'm going to go through sort of sector by sector and explain a little bit about really how we, it's important to look at some of the different parts of the labor market to understand sort of differences in how education related to it. So the first, and this is the, the second chapter of my book focuses on low wage work. So this sector in the late 19th, early 20th century was primarily domestic workers, or women. Women were primarily working as domestic workers and manual labor jobs for men. And the men and women who took up these forms of labor were typically the most impoverished, recent immigrants, and African Americans excluded from other jobs by the racism of their employers. This sector made up about 20 to 25% of the workforce, so was a very substantial number of people. And in this sector, paths to work into these jobs were successfully become structured by formal education. it wasn't for lack of trying, however. So in the case of domestic service, I find that a lot of philanthropists believed that low-wage workers were paid low wages because they were unskilled. So this was a really common interpretation of poverty in the progressive era or in this time period. And it's one that kind of blames workers for their failure to get higher wages. And these reformers believe that if, for instance, servants had more training through a school of house, like this was founded by the Women's Educational and Industrial Union, kind of a settlement house in Boston in 1897. If servants had more training, this would elevate the status of service work into a kind of profession, and would ensure that they would be paid better, right, have higher status in the labor market. The School of Housekeeping offered an 8-month course for young women in kitchen, laundry, chamber, and parlor, as well as house sanitation and personal hygiene. The problem was that very few domestic workers actually were interested in coming to this school. They didn't have time, or if they were going to, if these workers were going to spend time in school, they would probably spend it training for leaving the sector of domestic service, right? Going into some other kind of work rather than training to become a better servant. This school is open for a few years, and then after a handful of students enrolled in 1900, they decided just to shut down the school. So this sort of represents the, this failed model. Like if you provide vocational training for jobs that no one is interested in, they're not going to be very successful. There won't be much interest. Some low-wage workers did take advantage of other kinds of educational services. So things like daycare or kindergarten were really popular among working class immigrant families, especially where they could send their own children. Or some adult immigrants took advantage of things like English language classes that were offered by the public school system. But these forms of education didn't really change much about the conditions of low-wage work, as philanthropists had imagined, right? That you give workers higher skills will improve their conditions. That understanding of how education was going to work in this sector did not come true. And a lot of the same pathways into low-wage work, sort of informal pathways, sometimes very exploitative job practices, those persisted and still persist in the low-wage sector today. So that's kind of the story with low-wage work. In industrial jobs in manufacturing, we see different dynamics, but a similar sort of ultimate failure or close to failure of training for these types of jobs. So in this period, there is a huge amount of interest and rhetoric and discussion of men's industrial education. Training, this would be training for craftsmanship, for the trades, and for industry. The problem is that industrial education, when it's founded, never gets very high enrollment. And in historical studies, it's interesting because a lot of the scholarship on vocational education focuses on the industrial sector and focuses on especially men's education in this sector. But historically, it was actually one of the least successful forms of vocational education. And part of what limited the growth in this sector was that it was a field with kind of entrenched organized interests already, and in particular, craft unions in this kind of work. So craft unions, the power of craft unions depends on being able to control access into different craft jobs or different trades. And this was done through controlling the apprenticeship process, right? Through limiting access or by controlling training or education for entry into these trades. So unions want to control access. Employers want to get around union control because union apprenticeships are usually more expensive, right? They are regulated by the union. They also come with workers then are part of a union sort of ideology of worker power, and employers undercut the power of craft unions in this period. So they see trade schools as sort of a cheaper and easier way of getting around some of the union training process, right? If you can just train workers in a school over here, you can avoid training them through an apprenticeship process. So employers supported schools like this one. This was an evening trade school founded by the Massachusetts Charitable Mechanics Association in 1903. And craft unions, not surprisingly, are extremely opposed to these forms of schools, right? They think this is just a way for employers to create, strike breakers, to sort of undermine union control in the crafts. And because craft unions, especially in a city like Boston, that had a long kind of craft tradition, powerful, and actually they were successful in a lot of cases in shutting down some of these forms of training in schools like this one. Or if they couldn't shut them down, they were able to kind of reorient industrial education away from training in like a very specific craft skill towards more general education, general skills, or more scientific and theoretical training, rather than teaching, the actual like carpentry, masonry, and plumbing, for instance. And we see it in public industrial education because there is some union representation on boards that decide, what is the curriculum going to look like in the public school. Unions sort of helped shape it away from basically like substituting for a union apprenticeship. So given the failure of these efforts in industrial education by employers pursue a different strategy of sort of a different anti-union strategy by World War I. And their new strategy is essentially to develop large-scale mass production industries with huge corporate bureaucracies. And this means that rather than having, a small workshop with a lot of craft workers that are very highly trained as employees, you now start seeing, this sort of classic image of giant factories with a lot of machine operatives working on an assembly line. This is an example from the Ford factory. And these are workers that, as opposed to sort of highly skilled or highly trained craft workers, they can be trained very quickly. They're often, doing sort of repetitive jobs or operating machinery. So essentially, large companies shift their workforce away from powerful craft workers to other kinds of cheaper labor, like these operatives, that do not have as much power.
Christina, can I ask a question about that?
Yes, go for it.
I mean, you could see the mass production as being primarily a strategy for breaking unions, but I think more broadly and more powerfully, the economy of scale and division of labor just dramatically increased the productivity of workers and tremendously increased the industrial output. Yes, proletarianizing people, being put into these gigantic factories. But isn't this exactly the kind of technological change that's really driving, it's being driven by capitalist competition? I think, I mean, why are you making a big deal about schooling in this particular case? Isn't this just, a standard, I mean, sort of the Industrial Revolution, capitalist competition, concentration of ownership, increasing productivity, proletarianization of the workforce? Why is this a schooling story?
Good question. Yeah. And I completely agree that there's a lot of this story, this sort of economic transformation story, is driven by a lot of factors, not just a fight over union training, right, and apprenticeship. But I do think that that's an important piece of of sort of how it relates to training, because it transforms training in this sector of work, in the industrial sector, from one that is mainly kind of apprenticeship to these factory workers had a primary school education, or sort of a general training in literacy and numeracy, and then they would be very quickly trained on the job. So they didn't have the sort of long apprenticeship training process.
Right, because I mean, but shouldn't we just note that the division of labor in these large industrial places made workers easily replaceable parts in the process. Not much training. It only took a couple of days to train somebody to. It's so repetitive and so specialized that whereas the old craft union people had a lot of skill, a shoemaker or somebody who really had had to produce the entire product themselves. They had to know every aspect of it. Whereas this worked in favor of making an enterprise more profitable by reducing, almost eliminating the training cost required. So the skill requirements of these jobs was almost nothing. Just it was all brawn, no brains. I mean.
Yes, no, I think we're on the same page, right? Like I wouldn't disagree with that story. So it's, but I think the next piece, sort of what happens with white collar work, might also help explain why this is related to what's going on in the educational system at the time. But the argument here is just that these forms of training, the attempts to move training for these types of jobs into schools, by and large, doesn't work, right? And you're right, part of it is because they basically reduce the amount of training that is necessary for big sectors of work in the economy.
Right.
So let me go on, because I think the next piece might help make this connection a little clearer, and get back to the school system and why that's relevant. So this is sort of the side of how industrial jobs are. The second transformation that I mentioned, which is what's going on in white collar work. And this is connected to the first half, because if you are interested in creating sort of large mass production scale industries, this is also kind of the creation of new corporate bureaucracies and big corporations. And that requires a lot for work and a lot of sales. And so the other types of workers that you need in large bureaucracies are people like clerical workers, right? Or accountants, bookkeepers, clerks, secretaries, and then sales workers, both wholesale and then retail workers. And these are the fastest growing jobs in the economy in this period. So this is just also using census data, comparing clerical and sales work for both men and women in Boston in this period to the next largest group of workers. So for men, you can see that craft workers are a huge proportion of, or a large proportion of the economy. By 1930, 1940, they are eclipsed by the rise of clerical and sales workers. For women, the story is even more dramatic, that domestic work and personal service work is almost 40% of women in 1880 are in that kind of work. And 5% of women are involved in clerical and sales work, and clerical and sales work rapidly expands and becomes a primarily feminized sector by the 1920s, 1930s. So this is sort of the biggest labor market shift in this period, is this rise of clerical and sales work. And in this sector, schools are really successful. So in the 19th century, most clerical workers had learned, sort of like apprenticeship, like craft workers, they learned informally on the job. They often worked alongside a business owner or a merchant to learn, how to do the accounts, to do bookkeeping. But starting in the late 19th century, new types of schools specifically designed to train workers for these jobs emerged. And the earliest are actually in the private sector. I had no idea that this type of school existed in this period, but I found all these different schools that were called business colleges usually, even though they couldn't grant degrees. But they're kind of the for-profit colleges of their day. So they cater mainly to lower middle class immigrants, to women, and to populations that didn't have ready access to a mentor, say, that was already established in business. So they would go to one of these schools, and through this training, learn the skills that they could then use in jobs like clerical work. So things like penmanship, typewriting, shorthand, and bookkeeping. And I just have a sort of selection here of images of some of their catalogs and newspaper ads for these schools. And you can see that these schools are really, selling social mobility. So this middle image of a Bryant and Stratton catalog advertises that this school is, quote, your next step towards securing a position, gaining a competence, and amassing a fortune. So these were, it's funny too, the similarities between some of these forms of advertising, in the 1930s compared to for-profit colleges today. But I think this tradition goes back quite some time. And what makes these schools for white collar work really successful as opposed to industrial education is that there's no, there are no organized interest opposed to these schools. There are almost no labor unions in the white collar workforce. And you have all these educational entrepreneurs in the private sector kind of taking advantage of a totally untapped market as all these clerical and sales jobs open up. And now the popularity of business training creates a very broad coalition of different constituents who advocate for free public alternatives, most notably in the form of the public high school. So students, there are students now that want access to free business training. Employers are very happy to have their training costs paid for. And reformers want to undercut what they see as an exploitative for-profit sector. So this coalition of interests was very successful in really pushing for the expansion of public high schools. And we can see in this period, public high school enrollment expanded dramatically. And I found that it was mainly driven by students enrolled in commercial courses, or these are sort of courses related to business jobs. So this chart shows enrollment by women in different curricular types. And as you can see, the majority are enrolled in what's called the commercial course. So this means they would have taken shorthand or bookkeeping or typing. And this is followed by a smaller number in academic curriculum, industrial or domestic arts, or in college preparatory classes. And I found that even among those who took like general or even college prep classes, most of them went on to work in white collar business jobs. So in 1928, over half of all male high school graduates who go to work after graduation start in the business sector, and 5% of all female graduates who get a job right after graduation did so in office and sales jobs. So I argue that really public high school education in this period was effectively vocational training for office and sales jobs. And public high schools very quickly eclipse for-profit commercial schools in this period. So here you can see enrollment in proprietary schools in black compared to public high schools in dark gray. And towards the end, you can see also the rise of degree granting colleges and universities. But essentially public high schools, they're the ones that experience this vast increase, and proprietary commercial schools do not keep increasing. They kind of stay at a stagnant level. let me just pause there and see if any questions. Okay, I'll keep going.
I actually have another question since nobody else.
Yeah.
Part of the demand for education, don't you think, comes from low-wage workers, be they domestic workers or factory operatives, who want to have a different kind of life, want their children to be able to do other things than what they're doing. Did you want to comment on that? Most of the schooling that you've talked about is for the purpose of the worker, but what about the worker?
Yeah, I think one of my arguments is that it's really the success of schools in, you know, of public high schools, especially for second generation immigrants and women, that is one of the success stories of schooling in this period, or successes in the sense that, you know, schools offer these economic advantages. And I think that helps fuel this sort of broader ideology, if you want to call it that, of, you know, schools as a way of achieving the American dream. And throughout, I think there is a lot of widespread support, even among low-wage workers that send their children. You know, they aren't going to really be aided by education or training, but their children are, and they see this success and become a primary constituent of, you know, supporting public education, supporting more opportunities for their kids to go to school. So I think in this period, because of some of these realities of like how education does help students find jobs, this leads to broader support for education in this period. Yeah. I'll show you here a little bit about who is taking advantage of schools. So as I mentioned, the main constituents of this training were women and primarily second and third generation. This chart also, this is sort of one of the ways that I use census data, shows the percentage overrepresented of a particular ethnic group in an occupation. And that I measure by the difference between an ethnic group in the workforce versus their representation in a particular job. So this shows, you know, the way to kind of read this chart is we see it's showing ethnicity of women clerical workers. And at the beginning in 1880, you have a very high overrepresentation of white, this is women with Massachusetts-born parents, and a very low representation of Irish women. Whereas over the years, you can see that especially for Irish women, they grow in representation in this job, so that by 1930, they are fully represented in clerical workers at this time. In sales work, that's not shown here, you have a very similar story, but Russian Jewish women end up being very overrepresented in sales work by 1920. So these kind of demographic changes in the white collar workforce reflect how the children of immigrants were used in schools to enter these white collar jobs. And this, as I mentioned, kind of the success in using schools helps consolidate an ideology around education as a means of social mobility, and the idea that more skills, would equal a well-paying job. So now I'm going to talk about a few. So this is sort of the success story. There are a number of things that complicate this picture, or maybe a few holes in this ideology. So one is that the link between higher education and employment did not extend to all groups. So this chart shows the increasing enrollment of schools just among the children of low-wage workers. So this gets back to Stephen's question. Different working class populations in Boston. And I was kind of surprised to find that if we're looking at the children of low-wage workers, African Americans by far, like through this whole period, had higher rates of school attendance than either white students born in Massachusetts or immigrant children, so white born in Ireland. And they are all, rising in this period. But African American students, even though, based on the data, they're getting more education than any of these other groups, they were almost entirely excluded from white collar jobs. So education, does not offer the same advantages to everyone, and more education could not overcome job discrimination, especially seen in the case of African Americans. Second, remember, so the reason that employers are eager to hire, this new white collar workforce made up of women like this picture shows, is that one of the main reasons is that they are trying to undercut craft union power and develop these large corporate industries. So for employers, women are much cheaper than men. Kind of universally, women workers were paid almost half of what men were paid in these kinds of jobs. And clerical workers have very little organized power.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
So Susan was wondering if African Americans 14 to 18 are getting a different kind of education.
Oops. In Boston in this period, not that I could find evidence of. So Boston in this period had about 3 to 4%, 3 to 4% of the population was African American, and there were some neighborhoods where most African Americans lived, like in the South End in Boston, but in no neighborhood did African Americans form the majority of the population, which means that in schools, even in the South End in schools, African Americans would not have been a majority of the schools. So so there weren't sort of segregated neighborhoods because the African American population was pretty small. There weren't sort of very segregated neighborhoods in Boston. And so at least from what I've been able to see, they were getting similar types of education as the children of other low-wage workers in some of these neighborhood schools. And I think, I see the question, in-group comparison could be. Fan Mei, do you want to explain your question a little bit, or?
Sure. So when I'm looking at this graph, I can see that even though Black people had a higher school attendance, there was still significant racial discrimination going on. But if we just consider, for example, Black people in comparison to other Black people who didn't get education, did they get a better job, or were they paid better?
I think so, but in effect, it was the labor market was extremely segregated. So African Americans, some African Americans could get white collar jobs. Was in the very few businesses that were run and operated by Black business owners. So I think there's a very small segment of white collar workers that would have been available to highly educated African American workers, but that was a tiny percentage of this broader growing clerical workforce. And a lot of time, I have quotes sort of based on oral histories done in earlier years, kind of about the middle of the 20th century, that basically say my sisters, these are an African American man talking about his sisters who had a high school education, but the only jobs they could get were working in laundries or domestic service. So I think there were some opportunities, but the discrimination in the labor market was so prevalent that it really limited the difference that education could make.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Okay, So let's see. So I was talking about, another way that this ideology can sort of qualify it a little bit is thinking about how these women fit into the broader, this broader economic transformation. So from the employer's side, women are cheaper hires, right? They have less organized power. And I think this is an interesting case where we can see, for these women, these jobs were really, they were meaningful as a means of social mobility. They were a more respected and, cleaner working conditions than factory jobs or domestic service. But they also have this other dynamic that from the employer side, they represent a kind of shift in the workforce towards workers with less power, a cheaper workforce. These things are going on at the same time. All right, and then finally, the expansion, now we're sort of getting at what is the effect of this huge boom of high schools and clerical workers. And with the expansion of high schools and the influx of women and new immigrant groups into white collar work, this triggers a reaction among economic period. And this reaction is mostly taking place with new degree granting colleges and universities. So elites form an alliance with new private institutions in Boston, mainly private colleges and universities, to promote their graduates into the top managerial positions in business, as well as high-paying professions like law and medicine. So white-collar work in this period kind of differentiates into, on the one hand, we have this large pool of women clerical workers, what we would now call pink-collar work, right? Once it's been feminized, it's a majority women type of job. It becomes sort of pink-collar work and a very small elite of male managers at the top. So I argue that higher education kind of becomes a new basis of reproducing elite wealth in this period because of this marriage of college credentials, so higher education credentials, and the world of business management. And one of the set of sources that I use to describe changes in the elite are the records of university placement offices. And today, these are usually called career advancement centers, something like that, but they started in this period in the 1920s. And these records contain really fascinating letters between employers and placement officers that are describing the kinds of qualities that employers are seeking in college graduates. And the majority of these placements are into business management jobs. So it's interesting that there's very little written about the history of these placement offices, but they're one of the best sources to think about the kinds, the qualities that employers want in their elite managerial job. They view college students. So in the case of Harvard's placement office, I discovered that for the majority of business positions, it wasn't just academic skill, right, that's being discussed, but actually they're talking about social skills, religious or racial or class-based characteristics of graduates. These are all like openly discussed in this correspondence. So just to give you one example, Robert Hosmer, who is vice president of the Excelsior Insurance Company, writes to the Harvard Placement Service asking for an insurance salesman. And the director of the office writes back, and he's recommending this candidate named Burns. So he writes, Burns graduated in 1928 and is now 31 years old. While in college, he was pretty active in extracurricular affairs. He played on the baseball team 3 years, being captain in his senior year, was on the track team 3 years, and was on the football team his senior year. He was a member of the Hasty Pudding, the Institute, and the Varsity Club. He strikes me as being a bright, energetic, rather attractive young man. His father was Nova Scotian and the family are Protestants. So there were dozens of similar letters that I think demonstrate that while academic performance was, part of what employers were looking for, a lot of this discussion was about personality traits, extracurricular activities, and then we see religion, race, and placement officers also did not help everyone get a job. They openly admitted that they didn't help everyone because this would reflect poorly on their institution as a source of employees. So in 1930, the director offered an example of one student who was troubling him. Quote, he came to Harvard and majored in English literature with a better than average standard, but he still speaks the language of the scene shop. It is the men in this group that constitute the real placement problem. They are not the type of men the average employer has in mind when he says he wants a college men. So in other words, this was a college student from a working class background that this placement officer sort of thought, well, he's never going to have the right behavior, the right speech of a college man. And so these placement offices really are kind of making sure that they're only giving employers exactly the sort of imagined image of a college man that they are looking for. So I argue that class, racial, and gender characteristics were essentially incorporated into the meaning of academic merit itself, and the success of college graduates in getting these high-paying business jobs were viewed as the deserved outcome of their merit. But we can see, all these other factors at work behind the scenes. And in the realm of higher education, here's especially where I think the sort of credentialist theories from sociology can better explain what's going on than, say, a human capital explanation. So getting the top jobs in business are not just an issue of higher skill level, but how credentials become sort of a new and how schools become a new basis for reproducing class advantage. All right, so I'm going to sum up now. The broad, reviewing what we've just talked about, this period witnessed a profound transformation of training paths into the corporate economy. And in the sectors of low wage and industrial work, training options were unpopular or undercut by organized interests. Whereas in the booming sector of white collar work, schools that offered training for business fuel an enormous educational boom, which then became a new educational hierarchy. And in this process, schools help restructure social inequality. They allow employers to shift the workforce towards workers with more education, but less power on the job, and by fueling this new marriage between elite colleges and a corporate upper class. So what are the payoffs of this narrative? So as I see it, I think this narrative that I've just described can help us make sense of the paradox I began with, high educational access and high inequality. In this period, many students, especially women and the children of immigrants, are using schools to enter white-collar work successfully, which helps solidify a strong faith in education as a means of social mobility, because it had this real basis in lived reality. At the same time, educational expansion was compatible with high social inequality because employers used this new educated workforce to undercut the power of craft unions, and elites could use colleges and universities to control access to the top corporate positions. Another payoff, I think, is that it can help us make sense what happens in the middle of the 20th century. And so this was a period between the 1940s and the 1970s known as the Great Compression. Inequality went down in the United States. And human capital economists often point to the growth of public college education. So federal programs like the GI Bill, the expansion not of high schools, but now at the college level in this period, for pointing to that as one of the reasons that inequality goes down in this middle period. I think based on what we learned from the early 20th century, I think education was not, in fact, the primary factor. There were a lot of other more important factors in the reduction of inequality in this period. And mostly it had to do with the rising power of workers. So craft unions in the period that I was just talking about are almost completely wiped out by the 1930s. And a new dominant form of labor organizing in the 30s and the 40s were more inclusive industrial unions. So these unions organized kind of across skill level, were more inclusive of different genders and races. And these become the kind of powerful basis of organized worker power that push forward federal programs like the New Deal, the Great Society, and progressive income taxes that reach a peak in this period necessary to fund these different social welfare programs. So that's sort of the middle of the 20th century. As you can see here, by the late 1970s, inequality begins to rise, and that corresponds very closely to the reduction of labor rights, kind of the erosion of labor unions, all the while education continues to grow. And I think, like what we are seeing now, the early 20th century shows how education can be used by elites to concentrate power rather than to mitigate it. So going back to the slide of educational expansion, I think history helps us reinterpret the significance of educational expansion in this country. So I don't want, I think sometimes some have interpreted what I'm saying to mean that education is a bad thing, or that we should educational expansion, and that's not really the point. I think, if anything, this study shows that as long as education matters for access to work, students are going to demand it. And one of the things that we see in this early period is how public education really effectively displaces for-profit proprietary schools, which I think offers some lessons for how we can think about, how to eliminate the exploitative practices of for-profits in the present. Also, school-based paths to work did eliminate many more overtly racist or sexist structures of the informal labor market in the 19th century that also reproduced inequality. But I think that history shows us how formal education grew up with the corporate economy, and in doing so kind of reproduced a lot of the inequalities within that type of new economy. And now, especially at the top, has become a basis for the unequal distribution of benefits. So like what happened in the Great Compression, I would argue that school expansion needs to be coupled with a strong labor movement, strong social welfare programs, if we don't want most of the advantages of education to just be captured by an elite. So I'm going to end there, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts and kind of questions, thoughts, and general discussion.
I have a question. Many people have been arguing that the hourglass, people in sociology have been arguing that sort of the new hourglass shape of the economy, that's a result of the transformation from a kind of industrial to service economy, where there's more abundant, high-skilled jobs at the top of the hourglass and low-skilled jobs at the beginning, and the hollowing out of the middle of these good union jobs for people who don't have as high skills, have made skills which obtained through education all the more important for economic and social mobility. And I'm wondering whether that is inconsistent with what you've argued, is like how you think about that, because it would be it's very much a human capital kind of argument. And so I wonder how you think, you're talking about a time in which prior to this transformation, but how the theoretical framing that you're bringing to thinking about the importance of education inequality applies to the current hourglass shaped economy.
Yes, no, great question. And I think that story is right. I mean, I agree with what's going on, that you have a very limited number, but you have very top, this hollowing out of the middle, and then a growing number of low wage service sector jobs. And I think the problem with thinking that, so what I think the economic or the economist solution might say, well, if we have an economy that looks like that, we need to give everybody more skills so that they can compete for these higher positions. The problem with that is that basically then means there's more competition for a shrinking number of high paying jobs, which we know that not everyone is going to be able to get. So it's more competition for a tiny and shrinking sector of the economy that actually has well-paying jobs, rather than see this as a problem of what are we going to do to actually expand well-paying middle-class jobs, or what are we going to do to economy where you don't have to be a graduate, you don't have to have multiple credentials in order to make a living. So I think that education, if we just focus on an educational solution, I think that'll actually exacerbate, or that could exacerbate the problem. You would have more people competing over the same sort of limited set of jobs, rather than see this as a problem of the fact that all the reasons that we get this sort of hollowed out economy, which is that worker power is at an all-time low, that wages have been stagnant. And so I would want to shift the debate to think more about, how do you build worker power? How do you get, well-paying jobs back for a larger number of people, rather than sort of add more credentials onto the job requirements list.
Yeah, I want to say why I disagree with you.
Okay.
I think what's missing from your analysis is the driving phenomenon of technological change. The movement away from the craft-based industry, as we were describing earlier, to the large-scale division of labor in large-scale factories during the 30s and 40s, when the unions had their peak, was driven by technological change. And the destruction of the unions was not driven by education, but was driven by technological change. So I think that the Golden Cats book, I'm not sure that you've really contended with the key argument in that book, which is the relationship between the stock of human capital in the society and technological change. And regarding your assertion that if you have more education, you just have more people competing for a smaller number of jobs, I think that's not the case. In fact, Golden Cats point out, the college wage premium is enormous and it's been rising ever since the 1950s. The fact that there's such a dramatic gap between the pay of people who do and don't have education implies that there's actually a shortage of technologically skilled people, which is why, in fact, we're importing so many highly skilled immigrants. And so the possibility that the stock of human capital in a society can actually economic growth, which I'm sure you don't agree with, but I think you have to contend with that in your argument. And I think you have to have a way of explaining, if there's such a glut of skilled people, then we wouldn't see the massive premium that's being paid to people who have college education.
No, so thank you for that. No, and these are a number of different really good issues to think about. One, I think, so I think you're right that the college wage premium, is in the US compared to other countries is much higher. So we've created an economy where, you know, college credentials or now even higher credentials matter a lot for access to jobs. But I also think that, you know, what we're seeing with the rise of the 1%, and this is sort of Thomas Piketty's critique of Claudia Golden's analysis, is that you can't actually explain the huge, you know, surging income and wealth of the top 1% through an educational metric. That's sort of off the charts. And so I wouldn't say that, because the human capital story is that, you know, these really high paid 1%ers are making that money because it's it's rewarding them for higher skills. And I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests that, at least for explaining, you know, what's happening on the top end of inequality, can't just be a story of education. So that's sort of one piece. On technological change, like, I don't disagree that that was a primary shift in the economy, and, you know, we're going to see now, there's lots of discussions of, what is automation going to do to new sectors of work. And I don't think we can sort of educate our way out of that problem when a lot of what made manufacturing jobs well-paying jobs was, you know, organized labor, right? And workers have so little power now that I think that we still come back to this question of, you know, what does it take to, what are sort of the social political forces that are going to be required to have well-paying jobs. And I think if we kind of continue on the trend that we're on now, we'll have a few of those jobs, but low-wage service work, that's maybe a sector that technological change won't come to as fast. And we're seeing more organizing among teachers, nurses, healthcare workers. And that to me seems like a possible strategy for trying to create sort of well-paying jobs for the majority of people, rather than sort of educate ourselves out of these jobs. When I think that will.
Why is it either or?
Well, this is sort of the argument of why this is an education trap. Why that's the title is because I think that seeing problems in the economy as educational problems sort of obscures all of these other, you know, dynamics in the broader economy and what's happening with unions, what's happening with power, with, you know, the tax.
Unionists were always big advocates for their children getting an education.
Oh, no, of course. And I think that's sort of part of the story that I tell that explains, you know, why we have this sort of education ideology or this thinking that education can really solve economic issues. But I want to point out some of the limits. And I think that for especially the idea that education can replace for other kinds of labor market, you know, or sort of real political dynamics and the power of the working class, it can't do all that we are imagining that it can do.
So I've spoken too much and running out. Let's hear from some more people. Go ahead, Susan.
I just was wondering whether, okay, yeah, I was wondering whether, because our economy and you know, the skills that you need to be a productive worker maybe are changing very rapidly now, you know, with technological advances, that maybe education, you know, could be the route to, you know, reducing inequality if education focused on lifelong learning and adapting to new pressures rather than, you know, preparing you for skills that by the time you finish your education might be obsolete, but the learning and keep on pace with, you know, the demands for new skills.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree that, thinking about, allowing everyone to have access to free forms of education or ongoing training throughout their lives, I think that would be important. The danger, and this sort of goes back to this progressive era idea, that if you can increase skill level, that's automatically going to mean sort of higher wages, is that it essentially puts the burden of reform onto the individual worker, rather than saying, why don't employers pay their workers a higher minimum wage, right? Or if we just focus on a solution that's based on workers getting more skills, I think it lets employers off the hook, and it lets a lot of very powerful interests keep, running companies and organizations in a way that can still undermine the power of workers. There's no guarantee. We can imagine that there's going to be new well-paying jobs, but I don't think there's any guarantee of that. So who's going to guarantee that there are good jobs to be trained into? So that's why I think we still have to pay attention to kind of the broader political system, to how much power workers have, if we want to ensure that there's actually going to be good jobs at the end of that training process.
I think Jeff wanted to say something.
Yeah, hi, thanks for an interesting talk. I was just gonna follow up on Steve's point about technological change, but maybe from a different perspective. And in general, like, I'm very sympathetic to your arguments. But I mean, recently, and I'm not an alarmist, I can't predict the future, but I mean, increasingly, people are concerned about the possibility of like widespread and sustained technological unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
And, you've talked a lot about like the power dynamics between employers and workers. And, you can already see this in many industries as, minimum wages are raised in different areas, or organizers make gains in certain areas, and are, substituting capital for labor and
Right.
Displacing, eliminating those jobs and replacing them with automation and other machines. And self-driving cars seem like they're on the horizon in the next few decades. So I just wonder, when you talk of, I mean, I get the general argument about like, reinvigorating like the politics of distribution, but I wonder specifically like what exactly you have in mind for like this new form of organizing, because like I don't think the Teamsters are ever coming back, right? So whatever,
Yeah.
just because of technological change, so whatever this new politics of distribution looks like, it's going to need to look a lot different from what it looked like in the 50s and 60s and 70s.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think there's still going to be a big service sector, and those are some of the jobs that are growing the fastest, right? That maybe are going to be less subject to technological change or elimination. And I think, and so, teaching and nursing and healthcare, those are now, I think, the basis of a lot of new organizing efforts that I think could really, at least in a big sector of the economy, right, like reshape a little bit of the dynamics of worker power. But you're right that, in big sectors of the economy might just be eliminated. And, as a historian, like, I don't want to make too many predictions, but I think things like a universal basic income, like other sort of political solutions that would still require, I think, building sort of a mass working class movement to actually push for, but solutions that then try to decouple your livelihood from your, this employee-employer relationship, may have to be, or could be, yeah, a solution to that if we do end up seeing sort of more technological unemployment, and would also address some of the other key problems historically in the forms of worker power that have existed in the past, which have, you know, for craft unions, it was a very narrow group of mostly white men. Even industrial unions was still based on this sort of model of the family where women still did work, but it was unpaid. I think for rethinking sort of gender and family relationships, and breaking outside of a lot of the traditional workplace models that we have, it's going to take other kinds of political solutions. But I think we still are going to need to start with, you know, that's still going to require organizing, whether it's in a workplace or like in a community, to advocate for those political solutions. So that's still, you know, rather than thinking about educating, you know, like a workplace training program that would address technological unemployment.
So let me say that, you know, we've obviously run out of time. There's a lot of,
I just want to make sure that
yeah.
we say thank you, just in case
Yeah.
anybody does have to leave.
Well, that's what I was
say thank you,
yeah.
Dr. Grover.
Yeah.
And we can just give a round of applause.
Yes, right.
Oh,
But-
yeah,
Very exciting.
But at the same time, since Christina is willing, it seems to be willing to hang around. If you want to continue the discussion, please stay on. There's no reason. If you need to go, that's fine. And thank you very much, Christina. So those